couple of thank yous to begin with. First of all, a big thank you to Alex and Trang and the whole TI team for putting on such a great event and for having us here all today. Thank you also to all of you who've made it this far through the day. I appreciate all your time and attention. When I was talking to Alex about doing this session, he kind of gave me the dual challenge of not just presenting at the very final session on the second day, standing between you guys, you folks, and drinks, but also presenting arguably the most technical session of the conference. So we're going to see how we do with those challenges. Appreciate Alex and Trang kind of pushing us. Right. Well, let me give you a little bit of a background and a bit of an introduction to myself and what we're going to try and talk about for the next 40 minutes. My name is Tom Drummond. I'm the managing director of Heavybit, and we're going to talk about APIs for LPs. Hands up if you know what an API is. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. And keep your hands up if you know what API stands for. Still pretty strong. Still pretty strong. The reason that Alex and Trang invited me to come and speak is we think we know a thing or two about APIs. We happen to have some LPs as well. To give you some background, Heavybit is a early stage enterprise software focused accelerator and fund. We're grateful for TIs and many of your support in the room. We've got about 48, 49 companies now in the portfolio. It's about $7 billion in kind of aggregate portfolio value, including we had our first IPO just earlier this year, a firm called PagerDuty. And our focus, as I say, is enterprise software, but it's really developer tools and the APIs and the products that software engineers use. Actually, if I was going back through our portfolio and looking, and about 40% of all of the deals that we've done are API focused or API first deals. So this is kind of our whole portfolio. If we just kind of focus in on the handful of things that are really API first or API focused, it's a pretty good set of companies. I'm guessing that there aren't actually many software developers in the room. Oh, there's 1, 2, 3, all right. And we already know that a bunch of you know kind of what APIs are. How many of you have actually written software that uses some kind of external API? Yes, this is better than I expected. So who wants to give us a definition? Who wants to give us a good definition of what an API is? No? No one leaping at the opportunity? Jesse Robbins? No? Well, there you go. This is an API. Anyone, I'm assuming you can read that. Can anyone guess what this particular API call does? No? This is actually a firm called lob.com. Any heard of them? All right, well, with this one line of API code, this one API line, you write one line of code, and this happens to be actually in Bash or in shell script. Copy this, paste this into your terminal. This will send Alex and Trang a postcard. So with just a single line of code, you can get a postcard, a real actual live postcard, posted to Alex and Trang over in the South Tower of Suite 200. So if anyone wants to try that later and we can send Alex and Trang a bunch of mailers, please come and find me. We'll dig that out. To kind of step back a bit, APIs, they stand for Application Programming Interface. That's not a particularly helpful explanation. Really, an API is a contract, right? It's a determination or a set of standards that define how computers translate. They define the messages that get passed. They define the endpoints and things that get called. They define the software that you need to write to make sure you cause some action to happen on a separate machine. But really, an API, the main kind of purpose, the main thing that they do is they abstract away a lot of complexity. Behind a single line of code, you can run tons of computations or have access to lots of storage and compute power. But increasingly now, it's not just being able to manipulate bits and online resources, but you can use API calls to have kind of real-world impact. So that case in point, we send Alex and Trang and the TI team a postcard. With Uber's API, you can summon a car, right? With Airbnb's API, you can book a hotel room. And this is all well and good, hiding complexity, abstracting away complexity is a useful thing. And the reason it's most useful is because it helps us develop software faster. And as you've heard a bunch today and yesterday, software is kind of eating the world, and developers are scarce, and the ability for companies to build software quickly is kind of integral to their ability to kind of compete in the marketplace today. And so APIs, these complete units of functionality, these abstractions allow us to be really quick building the applications and software that we need. And that's why that, every application that you use today is composed of not just tens or hundreds, but thousands and thousands of API calls. The Airbnb application, you fire that up on your phone. Airbnb relies on firms like Stripe and Braintree. They call API commands to process their payments. They rely on firms like Mixpanel and for an API for their analytics. They require firms like Twilio and Nexmo to send you a text message every time your booking gets received or denied, right? All of these external services, all of these external APIs allow Airbnb to focus on the core things, the core competencies that matter to them, and not worry about the minutiae of, say, working with SMS messages or the vagaries of dealing with cross-border transactions and cross-border payments. And as I say, modern application development now relies on dozens and dozens and dozens of these APIs. And as you, this is kind of a largely LP crowd, as you might imagine, these APIs are exploding. It's a huge kind of fertile area for investment right now. Programmable web is a kind of a survey of APIs that gets done. There's 22,000 public APIs that they're tracking, is growing at 25% year over year, and it's been growing and growing and growing and growing. And these are just the public APIs. This is a kind of the tip of the iceberg, the things that people can call live over the web. There's thousands and thousands and thousands more private APIs that get built inside organizations that companies rely on to automate their business processes and to abstract some of the systems and processes that they have. It's also, as I said, it's kind of big business, right? In 2018, it's about $1.5 billion in venture capital just into pure API companies. Companies that are just, their entire business model is delivering a single simplified API. This doesn't count, the many hundreds of millions and billions of dollars more into enterprise software companies and developer tools companies that happen to provide an API. This is just pure API companies. And in the first 4 or 5 months of this year, we hit about $1.1 billion in investments into pure API companies. And I'm sure I just went, as we were building this deck, I just looked at the kind of handful of deals that have been done fairly recently. These are really, really big businesses. And, Auth0, it's an API for identity. They raised $100 million plus Series E. Tink, it's an API for banking. It's a $75 million Series C that happened this year. Not on this slide, but Plaid, they've raised a $250 million Series D, I believe, at the end of last year. Time and time again, you're seeing API first companies going and building really, really big businesses and raising a ton of money. So if APIs aren't part of your portfolio today or part of your GP's portfolios today, expect them to be kind of in the future. And in fact, increasingly we're going to see public companies that are pure API companies, like, for example, Twilio. So I'd love to kind of tell you more about what's going on in the world of APIs and how the API landscape is changing. And so as part of my panel today, we've brought 3 of our portfolio companies who are building in this new API economy. to come and talk about some of the things that they're working on and how their business has been growing over the last couple of years. So please, help me welcome Mathias Biilmann from Netlify, Sylvain Giuliani from Pusher, and Matt DeBergalis from Apollo. Thanks, man.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, man.
I'll use it in the middle.
Right. Well, maybe we can just kind of go down the line first, and you can all introduce yourselves and your company and talk about what is exactly that you do with APIs.
So I'm Matt Biilmann, CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Netlify is a platform for software developers to publish and maintain and build modern web applications and websites. We're both, in a way, an API for web publishing, but we're also a glue layer between modern way of building websites, where you no longer have like this large monolithic application, but instead you start taking advantage of all of these different API companies we saw and stitch functionalities together. And we help developers with that process of making it manageable to build large complex properties with help from lots of services like Pusher or Apollo or modern front-end frameworks or Stripe or so on.
That's awesome. Matt?
Matt DeBergalis, founder and CTO of Apollo. We're the data graph company. So what's a data graph? Tom talked about the example of Airbnb, where it's talking to all those external APIs as part of it. There's also hundreds of internal APIs at a company like that. And the challenge that the rise of APIs has caused for teams that want to ship great apps, great user experiences, is every time you want to build a new feature, you have to wire up all those APIs to that new screen or that new iOS app that you're building. And if you think about a modern experience, Airbnb's probably got some kind of a recommendations API, some kind of a real-time pricing API, some kind of a property catalog API, some kind of user trust API, right? The list just goes on and on and on. So a data graph is a way to organize all that into a catalog, so that when I want to build a new product, instead of having to know about each of those APIs and know how to talk to each of them separately, it's a little bit like Amazon Prime, where I just pick out the data I want from each of those in whichever combination I like, and the graph organizes all that and allows the product developer to pull that into their screen without writing a lot of code. So this is all built on an open technology called GraphQL, and we'll talk more about it.
Yeah, thank you. Sylvain?
Hi, I'm Sylvain Giuliani. I'm the CRO at Pusher. And so at Pusher, we provide developers with a real-time API. I won't go into too much technical detail, as Tom mentioned, but suffice to say that we help developers build communication and collaboration inside the app. So if any of you today came to this event or are leaving this event using Lyft, when you open the app and things are moving in real time, whether it's the car, the price, or things like that, well, behind the scene, this is using Pusher. If you are right now on your mobile phone and looking on the homepage of New York Times or ESPN, if something is happening in real time, that is powered by API. So these are type of real-time APIs that we provide developer with.
Don't worry, so I don't think anyone is looking at their phone right now. You've got the full focus and attention. Just so, again, this is kind of a big LP audience, so maybe kind of to set the stage a little bit, like, can you tell us how much money you've raised, who from, like, just kind of give us a sense of the scale of the company?
Sure. So actually, Pusher is originated from London. We recently opened an office here in San Francisco. We've been pretty frugal on that front, so we've been around for 7 years. We only raised 11 million the past 7 years. The last time was earlier in 2018. We raised 8 million from Passion Capital, from Balaton and Heavybit. And before that, we raised a bit less than $1 million from Passion Capital back in London.
And Matt, you have some recent fundraising news, right?
Yeah, we just announced our funding for Apollo from Andreessen Horowitz and Matrix, 22 million, I think it was.
Congrats.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And Mathias?
Yeah, we share investors in Andreessen. We've raised 45 million over 3 rounds, an initial seed round with Heavybit as a small participant, with Bloomberg Beta and Designer Fund and a whole group of angels in the space, and then a Series A from Andreessen of $12 million and a Series B from Kleiner Perkins and Andreessen of another $30 million last year.
All right, well, the VCs are obviously interested in APIs and Netlify in particular. What is interesting about building something in APIs for you, or in this space in particular?
So in our space, like we were looking at it from the web publishing part of things, where traditionally everything was built by developers as big, clunky applications, right? So you'd essentially, for every website, build a large database-driven application with a lot of different layers in it and all the different functionalities, right? Like back in the days, if you were building in e-commerce, you would integrate some payment gateway into your big application and you would build that out, right? And then we started seeing these changes happening where a company like Stripe could completely replace all that development work with a single piece of JavaScript, and where a company like Algolia could replace your built-in search functionality with a piece of JavaScript you could call out to, and where we started seeing like completely new development patterns, like what's happened with Apollo and the data layer, or with tools like Prisma now, or on the front-end layer, like all of the different component-based frameworks that started coming out. And we saw that there was like sort of a whole transformation in how web development would work, and even the role of a web developer changed from being split into people that mainly just like transferred design to some markup and handed it over to these back-end developers that would build these big applications. And instead, we had a whole new generation of front-end developers that just built complex applications in the browser, talking to all of these different APIs. And our early realization was that for the old world of building big monolithic application, there was a whole set of providers that had built like very advanced platforms and tool chains around that. So when you started moving to this new way of building, there just wasn't a lot of glue, and there wasn't a lot of processes and help for the developers. So every single company started building their own like stitching together tools for continuous deployment, for CDN management, for DNS management, for pre-render services, for ways of storing environment variables to talk to all these different APIs, to glue them together and so on. And these in-house builds, these tools that big companies would build in-house would not be very developer friendly, and they would be clunky to work with and so on. So we saw the opportunity to build like a really developer-first product that sort of took this new way of working and made it a one-click setup that gives you all the best practices and so on.
And can you kind of give us a sense of, you know, how many developers use the product, and like how many API calls are you getting?
Yeah, we have more than 500,000 developers on the platform by now, and have around like 30,000 new developers and businesses signing up every single month. Sites on our network gets accessed by around 200 million unique visitors every single month, and we do billions of web requests and millions of builds and deploys every single month.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And Matt,
sorry, I'll add something quickly. Oh, sorry, that's my bad. So just to add something on what Matt said about like the shift of how people build apps. I think this is something that we capitalized the same thing. So for us, was very similar that we saw today, like Matt was saying, like this Prime Now, like it's like everything is happening now. You want like things delivered now. You want to look on your DoorDash when you order food, you want it now. And so for us, like real-time live experience was something that was really, we saw the shift happening. And then the second big shift that we've seen, and to drive the adoption of API, is like nowadays we believe that every company in the world is bound to either die or become a tech company. And well, you know, the top talent, the top engineers, they're all going, you know, to work at Facebook, Google, you name it, like the big company. You know, customers like ours, like the New York Times, the e-commerce website across the corner, or anything like that. Well, they don't have access to those top engineers, and so we need to provide those, you know, I would say those above average developers with superpowers to compete and be able to build the same experience as the best companies. And so this is where companies like ours comes in to kind of like fill that gap. And even if you look at like the universities numbers, like how many new developers are getting created, I guess, out of universities and boot camps and whatnot, there's not enough developers in the world to sustain the demand of like building application, like because today everybody's building application, whether you like it or not, it's like, a dog walker is going to have an application at this stage. I mean, my dog walker has an own bespoke application. And this is where our products and our company come in, really.
Matt, just on this idea of kind of superpowers for developers, I mean, a big portion of what you're doing is open source, right? So there's a whole slew of developers who can access the product for free and really kind of ramp their own development. Is that right?
Yeah, and there aren't enough developers in the world. Is part of the issue here. Yeah. So I think
some of them are in this room. I don't
yeah, but we need more.
Yeah.
So part of that means we need technologies that let a developer get more done each day and not spend their time on building plumbing or having to do something that every other company is doing exactly the same way, that it has nothing to do with that product. But the other thing going on is all three of us, and I think probably all the companies you had on the slide earlier, it's not just that we're building API technology, it's that it's all technology that can be adopted by a developer on their own and is attractive to a developer. It's not something that gets sold to the CTO at a big co and everybody comes in Monday morning and discovers they're going to be trained on a new thing. And I think the reason for that is developers, because they're so few and because the demands on their time are so strong, end up having a lot of power to select the technologies they want to use. Because in practice, if the developers don't like this stuff, there just won't be that critical mass around it, and you won't get the community and the ecosystem. And I think that's one of the cool things about the open source movement just in the last 10 years or so, where we've shifted now toward a world where it's the stuff that's good that tends to rise and gain steam versus stuff that's backed by a particular like go-to-market or a sales team or whatnot. And I'd look for that characteristic in API companies in general.
So the way to win is just have better tech. Is that the right?
It's not better tech. It's a better developer experience. Yeah. It's something that a developer likes so much that they get very angry if you take it away from them, and they tell all their friends. Yeah. That's kind of the measure.
And Mathias, you've built a big community of developers around a particular almost philosophy, right? Is that, you want to talk about the Jamstack and
yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when we saw this movement away from these monolithic applications as the way to build websites towards splitting up sort of the presentation layer from the API layer and so on, we started finding out that there was also a need for the development community to even have a way to talk about that architecture and started to talking about the Jamstack architecture, JavaScript API and markup is sort of like this new stack that's moved up a little, where the stack developers used to work with was very tied to like the operating system, the specific database, and the web server they were using. And suddenly it became about like the markup you deliver to a web browser and the APIs you're talking to from that web browser. And this JavaScript is this universal runtime that glues everything together, right? And that was sort of a big shift away from working on this very low-level infrastructure side of things to essentially working at the level of the browser where end users run your code on their devices and you talk to all these different services, which is like very much also what drives a company like Pusher being part of that kind of access to real-time functionality and so on, right? Like,
yeah, and again, like to continue on the community aspect of things, like most of API's companies, like we are focusing on acquiring the developers, and you can see like everybody in this room like are talking about thousands and thousands of developers because that is how you're gonna get market share. And also like these are like the people, they are very powerful decision maker. Like, as Matt was saying, is if the CTO comes in and say, hey, we're gonna start using this new product, and the developer or the engineers don't want to, they'll probably just quit and get a next job like 2 hours later because they're in such a high demand, and so they hold so much power that's why having a large user base, like community-based approach to our go-to-market strategy is primordial. And you mentioned like you have nearly 500,000 user at Pusher. We're talking about the similar. Like every month there's like more than 15,000 new developers that are coming to our platform to trial our new product to solve their problems, and it's even bigger numbers in the open source community, right? So this is kind of the new shift.
Isn't part of the challenge with having all these developers is like, your average developer doesn't like spending a lot of money, right? They don't, $5 a month on a piece of software is kind of like a big deal to them. Like, how do you get past that, right? How do you build a business and not just a thing that developers love?
So it's about like for us, what we find out is like it's about enabling them to become champions inside the organization, because they are very passionate, as Matt was saying, about the tool and the craft. Is like they will say, this is the best thing, like we need to use it, we need to buy it, and you need to arm them with the right content, the right information for them to champion your technology inside the organization. And then that person will pull the rest of the stakeholders to you, or at that point you evolve and you have a sales force that do that proactively. But that's very much like how we found that, how you get to those big ticket. And again, if you look at the IT budgets or like the new engineering budget in the organization, like these budgets are ballooning, and so those people have more and more money to spend. And yes, before $50 was probably, wow, as an engineer, it's like, you don't want, like, I'll do it myself. Yeah. Like that was probably the reaction, not knowing they cost thousands of dollars to the employers. But now they kind of like, yeah, I want to throw money at this problem because I have better, more important core IP to do to solve my business needs, right? It's like they don't want to be a real-time company. They want to be a media company or whatever it is.
Yeah, and the way a lot of these businesses work is what's actually happening is the developer is making the technology choice pretty early on. Mm-hmm. And they'll almost inevitably lock their team into a decision that we're going to use technology X or technology Y or whatnot. They don't really have the money, and developers are cheapskates, right? They'll save $50 by spending 10 hours on some little script or something, which makes no sense. Yeah. But it's just not how engineers tend to think about it. So the trick is usually there's some moment where you can talk in terms of the business value of that technology choice to somebody in the organization that does have that budget. And a lot of these things work best when you can find something for which that budget is really normal. And APIs are great for that because IT infrastructure has always sat on the giant pile of money in the organizations, right? Like they're not afraid to spend money on this stuff. So once you find a story for why this is like business critical or why this drives value for the company or whatnot, usually at that point, you're not talking to the developer anymore, and you're not trying to get $5 or $500 from them. It's a totally different conversation with a different.
Can you kind of ballpark, for the audience, like big customers when you're thinking about these spends? Yes, you're selling a developer product, but a large customer with you, like, what's a typical ACV for a big deal for you, Sylvain?
So for us, like a typical like big deal ACV, we're talking about like nearly a bit more than $500,000 a year contract. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, like that's the beauty of our business is like we're all talking about recurring revenue, very strong lock-in in technology, because when you just implement it, like spend a month or more to implement it, like it's very difficult to rip out, and so you have very low churn. So that's kind of like a sweet spot.
But those $500,000 customers, they start at $5, or do you have to go and find them a different way?
So for the way it works for us is like, as Matt was saying, is like that small developer is going to come in and say, hey, we need to build this real-time mapping thing, and let's call her Lisa. Lisa, the software engineer, is going to say, hey, this is what we need to be using. She's going to go back to her PM, and PM is like, yeah, okay, that's cool, and we're going to use this technology. It looks kind of like okay. And at that point, we're going to see an initial spend of like a proof of concept or something like that. We're talking maybe $20,000 a month, like initial year contract, and then that quickly balloon up when they roll out, to the full like user base or app or whatever the thing they do. So once we go to production, like we hit the spend.
And same with you, Matt and Mathias, the same kind of ballpark figures.
Yeah. Yes, but also another way to look at this is like MuleSoft, which just manages other APIs. It's not even really an API itself. Salesforce bought them for what, $6-7 billion last year, right? I mean, and that's on the back of much higher ACV. That's what it looks like when you're doing deals with the Fortune 500 and they're 8-figure deals. Yeah. Because the issue is APIs are super sticky. Once a company selects an API and builds applications on top of an API, it's incredibly costly. So the shelf life of this stuff is like 10 to 20 years. And if you think about what's the value of getting that right at a company that knows it can't move off of that for that length of time, and what's the value of having a stable vendor behind that that can support them over the lifespan of that platform, it's not small, right? It starts to look like this sort of deal.
I mean, look, I love APIs. This all sounds great. You know, you build something great. Developers have good taste. They find you, they pay you, and then all of a sudden, 6 months later, they're paying you $500,000. They've got to be challenged. What sucks about building something in this space? What's hard about building an API-focused company?
I mean, as you said, like, it's easy for us to talk to developers. They are cheap steaks sometimes, and so one of the biggest challenges for us is always how do you go from Lisa, the software developers, to, you know, Sarah, the CTO, or the big IT budget holder. That's one. And then the value proposition between, hey, I'm going to help you scale your real-time infrastructure. That's probably very nice to Lisa. As the CTO, probably don't care as much. And so it's like, what do we solve as a, what do we solve for Sarah, the CTO? And same thing for the CEOs and other business owners. So how do we translate that developer, like the value that we provide to developers to the value that we provide to the rest of the organization? Like, that's always
kind
really
of
difficult.
two-headed or two-sided approach.
Yeah, it's like the messaging is like, hi, I'm going to talk you tech. I'm going to show you some code. That's easy. Hey, let me tell you why you need to build real-time features into your app to increase your ROI, your engagement rate, and tell me like a second order of magnitude of benefit from our core product.
Well, you won't have to go and hire another, 40 developers at $250,000.
But again, these are like very pragmatic. But like as Matt said, like not a lot of people think about like I'd rather spend $10,000 a month on Netlify, for example, instead of hiring 3 engineers. Like they'll be like, I'd rather hire 3 engineers.
Right.
That costs 5 times.
Just in general, to echo that, right? Like when you target developers in this kind of company, right? Like it's essentially like the whole marketing in that aspect is like a consumer company, right? Like developers are just a special side of a type of consumer, and they're not. It's not necessarily like that they pick the best kind of technology. There's also a lot of like branding and like taste and like random things that developers find cool or whatever, right? So you have to really speak like and build a whole marketing strategy to a segment of consumers, but at the same time, at the other end, you're actually selling to enterprises, right? So it's very hard to build that dual communication strategy because sometimes you'll see that these companies then start focusing on the enterprise customers, and then they lose the top of funnel from the developers because they change the way they talk, and developers start thinking, oh, they're no longer cool like us, right? So constantly building that tension is really interesting. One of my favorite examples is like Twilio's landing page that has this beautiful trick of like having a big call to action, like the biggest call to action. It's like a pretty enterprisey site in some ways, but the big call to action says like, get your API key now, right? And you know that no procurement person and no business person would ever click on that, right? Like it's only ever developers. But then right below it says, or talk to an expert, which is like whatever you like. And building in those kind of flows and figuring out how to navigate those two kind of audiences at the same time on the same website with the same brand, that's always a challenge.
That's good stuff. Well, again, we've got tons of LPs in the audience here. I'm all big believers in APIs. If you put yourself in their shoes, there seems to be an API for everything now. API for humans, API for cars, API for chat and data and websites. If you had $50 million of of these LPs' money, what are the APIs that you'd be going and investing in? And no picking anyone on stage. Like, what are the things, either the companies or the market segments in there, where the API for hotels or the API for travel that you think are interesting?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm so focused on the web space, right? So I'm looking a lot at like just the traditional platforms around like Adobe Experience Manager or Magnolia or all of these big systems, right? And then looking at like what big chunks of those that developers were integrating and building time and time again are starting to split out to independent, like, headless APIs that no longer comes with a whole site builder and so on, right? And I think we've seen like the headless CMS space already starting to mature, and that's one part of it, right? But there's going to be headless e-commerce as well, and that's one of the areas I find interesting there. There's going to be new design tools to work on that whole stream of producing like components for the front end. There's going to be probably more competition in the search space and so on, right? And
so $50 million API for Photoshop, API for Macromedia.
Or for things like, a lot of the things that you also mentioned that every big company builds in-house, right? Like, so recommendation engines, things like that, right? Like, that you see big enterprises build over and over again. Like, there's no reason someone shouldn't be able to abstract the core functionality of that and say to any developer as well, do you want a recommendation engine? Just call this, like, just include this bit of JavaScript and you have it.
How about you, Matt?
I agree with all that. I think another place I'd look is in the enterprise, like in the large enterprise, where what's happening is this transformation. It doesn't happen all that often, but enterprises are now essentially having to retool their whole internal software stack to do exactly like the Jamstack style. Every enterprise CIO is coming in, and he's basically like, why can't we make software that's like half as good as the games my kids play on the phone? Like, how hard could this possibly be? And so what they're doing is they're going through that whole transformation process. And I suspect everything that's in the enterprise today, from like the Oracle database up through God knows what, right, is all primed for replacement by a modern API designed with developers' needs in mind first, instead of being designed 20 years ago against the needs of the old way we built systems. And I suspect that there's hundreds of companies to be found in that space just because of the scale and scope of what these organizations look like.
APIs for ERP and human capital management and lots of very dull,
That's
boring
right.
business processes. Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Sil?
Yeah, so I guess I had the chance to have more time to think about the question. So thank you, Matt. So I'll riff on map number 2 ideas. Is like, I was astonished recently to see that most of the company are not on the cloud or things like that. For us, like, it's obvious that everything runs on the cloud. It's not. And so this massive migration coming out from like on-prem to the cloud, like nowadays with technology like Kubernetes and things like that, this is like a big movement, like a big way of like doing that migration. So that's one, but like always the benefit of like on-prem, always has been like security and control. So I see a lot of like potential from like things like Kubernetes and the whole ecosystem, but also around like security on the cloud. So that means not like only firewall and all that stuff, like that doesn't really matter that much anymore. I mean, it's needed, but it's nothing crazy revolutionary nowadays. But it's like, how do you do security on the application layer? So that's really interesting, because that's always the thing, is like you give the key to the castle to the big cloud provider. Like, how do you ensure that nobody hacks your data, right? And especially now with the rise of like leaks, like things get hacked all the time. And then on a completely different side, from the B2C side, like, I'm sure if you have kids or even yourself nowadays, you're going to come and you're going to say, oh, I have chat, I have videos. Like, how many times you see people in the street having like a FaceTime call or similar video call? Well, this is kind of like a very consumer behavior. And if you see the new generation coming in, like, we used to be the email generation, I guess, the people in this room, or the phone generation, like nobody pick up the phone anymore. Now people either text messages or do video, right? And so again, like, the next big migration I see, the trend is going to be, how do the businesses capture that intent of like, hey, everybody's doing something on video. How can I bring like live video conversation and things like that inside my business, inside my social graph, which is, I think that's the other thing that, I mean, we're seeing is like, people don't want to send their users to Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. They want to bring their user to their own social graph, because they don't want to have like a social group like, sports teacher, fantasy football, and co-workers sitting next to each other. Right, they want to be in the same ecosystem. So again, like, application like videos and like video API, live video APIs, things like that are like very interesting to me.
That's awesome. Are there other broad trends that you think are happening in APIs now that are interesting for this audience, or interesting from your perspective?
I think so again, to say what Matt said, at the beginning, is I think the last few years, if you use Twilio's, Stripe, those kind of API provider, they brought the old world online, how do you do payment but online and easily, right? And now we have this new, I would say, generation of API who actually don't bring the old world online. It's more about how do we build feature and capability online. So we have Algolia with search, for example, Contentful. How do you manage your content and things like that? We had Auth0 on the screen, which is how you do security. So it's identity as a feature at the API level. And so there's this new level of abstraction where you have basically the cloud. You have Twilio, Stripe that brings the old lab, the physical world online. And then you have these new features coming in on board. It's how do you do search, video, as I said, or things like that that are built on top of that.
Then there's obviously all of this is sort of a big unbundling of all of these things that used to live in libraries and so on into different companies that operates them for you, right? And then whenever that happens, you start seeing the opposite of how do you then actually make it manageable for developers to put them all together with, which is where a company like mine come in, but there's a lot of movement in that space in general, right? Because of course when you had imagine you had just as a really different example, a WordPress-based website, right? And you wanted to enable some feature, well, there would be a set of plugins within the WordPress ecosystem that you could just go and enable, right? And once you start having this unbundling, it's more powerful, right? You have much more dedicated companies running all these different services. But as a developer, you suddenly have to, every time, stitch all of them together yourself and sign up for each of them and create API tokens and manage secrets and figure out how data flows between them and so on, right? So at that layer, both from the browser layer and from the layers below, like Apollo or Prisma and so on, we're seeing more and more companies come out to help developers also solve this problem of how do I become really productive in putting together these different APIs and discovering them and combining them.
One of the kind of common themes that we've been hearing at this event is just about AI and ML, and there's a couple of takes on that. One is hiding complicated artificial intelligence and machine learning models behind a simple API call, and the other is using AI and ML to knit some of these things together, or understand the API landscape better and combine them together. Are you seeing that happen with your own APIs or with your own products? Do you use a lot of machine learning in what you're doing today?
We have a lot of customers that want. Here's an example of a challenge, right? I'm a company with a lot of different apps, and I just made a $10 million investment in some machine learning infrastructure. I'm not done until I've wired that into all those apps, right? And it's actually really common to see examples where all this energy went into a system, but then it only ends up touching a fraction of users. So it's I think really vital that I'm not even sure it needs to be a simple API, but something that is easily consumable by a developer, right? Something that's easy to wire into my app is probably the thing that enables a technology like that to make its way into more and more of the space inside an organization. I think that's an important characteristic of a lot of these systems.
Well, and just go ahead.
Oh yeah, I would just say, but where I'm still not really seeing it happening is in this idea of having AI be the part that wire things together, because
I don't buy that part.
No, and it's the same sort of with observability and so on. You have AI detecting what's good and what's bad and so on, and there I think we're still at a point where it's too opaque why the AI takes any specific decision for anyone to really trust that it doesn't sometimes take completely wrong decisions, right?
But Matt, to your point about accessibility, APIs are currently the domain exclusively of very technical people, technical developers, right? There are more and more low-code, no-code environments out there. Is there a point where APIs are accessible to everyone?
Yeah, I think I mean, Twilio is a good example. I think the story is every new employee at Twilio has to write an app that uses Twilio, right? And it doesn't have to be a complicated app, but this stuff isn't that hard to use. And I think software development in general got needlessly complicated along the way. And there's, I think, an opportunity to bring some of that back home. One use case we see with Apollo, for example, is, so I mentioned we have this idea of a data graph. So there's this universal API, this menu of all the stuff and all the capabilities you can get to. Obviously, you build apps on top of that, but we also see people in like the support organization just using it directly, right? It's a little bit like SQL. You can type a query and you can get your data. So why should I have to build a special like app for my support staff to figure out what happened with someone's credit card charge? Why can't I just give them the tools to go to the API directly? Now that doesn't really pencil out for most use cases today with most APIs. We're not there yet, but I think that is probably directionally where things could head. I think business intelligence is another example like that. There's a product management. There's a lot of people in the org that need to consume that data. And the blocker for the most part is the lack of an app that sits between them and that. And if we can eliminate that, I think it enables a lot more use of some of this underlying technology.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, like API at the end of the day, it's just a tool in a toolkit for type of worker, the same way, we could go outside and buy like a crankshaft to fix our car or something like that. I might be able to use it, maybe other people might not be able to use it, or vice versa. Like it's kind of like the same, but it does one job usually. It does it really well. That's how we win the market. And if you want to use it, it's there. It's on the shelf. You just have to watch a YouTube video to learn how to use it. I would say that's probably.
But in a similar way as with that crankshaft, right? Like even if it might not be that hard to learn to use it, a lot of people will prefer having someone that they really trust know how to use it, operate it for them, right? And I think that's the same. Like in the web space, we've always seen like, for as long as I've been in space, always seen this idea that like web developers would be replaced by site builders, where people drag and drop and build websites, right? And all the time it turns out that most business owners, what they want to do is not sit and drag and drop to try to build their own website. They want to hire someone to build them a really good website, right? And the way we build websites keeps evolving. Like when the automated tools gets to a certain stage, a new type of device come up and everything gets reinvented, or a new type of UI pattern comes up that everybody wants and that requires custom development and so on, right? So I'm not so inclined to think that the APIs will get to a point where everybody just use them directly. I think we'll always see like a very useful market for tools that allow certain sort of applications and so on being built directly by the users of those applications, and then we'll see a much larger market for real professional developers building stuff for businesses.
I did want to just give.
Sorry, just real quick. I think we are kind of at a like maximum hardness point. Like building a mobile app is incredibly hard. And, most adults learn how to use Excel somewhere along the way. Maybe not well enough to run a quant fund on it, but you can do a budget. Actually, you probably could run a quant fund. I don't know. I can't. And back in the 90s, we had Visual Basic. And this stuff wasn't such a bright line where it had to be a professional that had to know all this esoteric knowledge before you had anything that was of interest to somebody. And maybe it's more hope than confidence, a mix of both. But I think we're going to move back toward that over time. And at least my hope is it will be easier to consume this stuff. Maybe not in its present form, but as this evolves.
Yeah. So developers are not out of a job just yet.
I did not worry about that.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, I did just want to give a couple minutes if anyone from the audience had any questions. More than welcome to take them, technical or non-technical. Yeah.
I'm Mike Malevich from SSM Healthcare in St. Louis, Missouri. So we're a large corporate, $7.5 billion. Our systems are ripe for disruption. when, please can I see APIs for all of our business systems?
There's a handful of companies we'd be happy to introduce you to that are building powerful APIs for healthcare systems. I think there's a lot of, in fact, maybe this kind of question for you folks. Traditional industries, are they already being touched by healthcare, insurance? I mean, financial services, we've seen a couple of examples on stage, but are you starting to see real impact of APIs in these legacy or traditional industries?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, healthcare for us, for example, is something that we've seen a lot of potential and growth in. The barrier there is always to be like compliance, and so that's always the tipping point where you are 10 people, going through HIPAA compliance, SOC 2 compliance is very difficult, but it's just a checkbox that we need to do. And now that we're approaching 100 employees, now we're doing all the compliance to be there. But there's definitely a shift in that market to be closer to the patient and building those forced communication collaboration. So we see a lot of very straightforward use cases of how to interact with the patient, and also again, like I was saying, the businesses have to become a tech company, otherwise they'll just be overrun by the competitor who does it. And so we're seeing a lot of interest from any type of business. I mean, even businesses Moen, who provides showers and things like that, use our technology to remote control shower heads and they're connected. How do you call it? I want to say bathroom system, but it's not as sexy as, I don't say it the right way for them. Their marketing department will kill me. Yeah. But even those kind of industry are adopting APIs and doing things like that.
It sounds both amazing and terrifying having an internet-connected shower head. So maybe we'll leave it at that and thank our panel. We're facing it.
I got to work with facility folks all day long. They should have data at their fingertips. They got to go search a database. They got to run a query. Yeah. It's a week. Yeah. When are we going to have something that's for the enterprise that's visually based, graphically based, and is not an email in a week? It's an app.
Come and talk to us. I'm sure there's things that we can build, our portfolio companies can kind of build for you. Yeah, no, it won't be instantaneous compliance issues, but it's hopefully closer than you might imagine. One last question, then I think we've got a wrap for Alex.
Hi, I'm Patrick with Zeus Technologies. And my question is, for mission critical APIs, as CEO, how do I get assurances from your companies that you're going to be sticking around or not going to kill the API once you're acquired?
That's why question.
You should be happy to pay a high price.
Yeah.
And I'm not really joking, right? What I've found when we talk to our enterprise customers is they expect and need a long-term partnership, and I've found understanding our roadmap and our plans as a company is almost more important than what the thing does today or what it's going to do tomorrow, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think strong investors speak to that. I think strong developer adoption speaks to that. It gives confidence that the technology is stable, and just a comprehensive partnership that goes beyond here's a piece of software, have fun.
All right, folks, we're getting the hook from the sidelines, but I want to thank you all for sticking with us for this last panel, and maybe we can just thank our panelists for coming up and chatting. Cheers, lads.